widow today, she had to seek her own justice because she had no financial resources. It wasn't like today with Social Security or even insurance. So she had no financial resources in which to bribe the judge. She didn't have any political clout as a widowed woman in that culture in order to squeeze sort of justice out of this callous adjudicator. Neither does the widow, we don't know what age she is, seem to employ any feminine wiles in an opportunity to manipulate this guy. But she does have one gift, one tool, one weapon in her arsenal, and that's persistence. And she seems to understand the power of persistence, and she wields it with sort of an unfailing tenacity and skill. The Greek's a little obscure in terms of what the unjust judge, who neither fears God nor other people, really says. The word literally translates, we translate it as wearing out, and the literal translation of that is that she will give me a black eye. I think what he's talking about there is a reputation problem because he keeps refusing to hear her. Her legal opponent seems to be more stern than anyone else. We don't seem to know what her case is, and so she picks the judge as the point of leverage for which her persistence will work and work. He's the focus of the attention, not the opponent. Perhaps it was even an in-law family that was obligated to take care of her. That was the Social Security network, but we don't know exactly what the injustice is that's against her. Yet we know that she doesn't have very many good options as a widow in that culture. Without family, without influence, without status, she could only count on her own unswerving demand for justice. Her own overwhelming need for a just verdict was the only thing that she really had that she could use, and she didn't let it go to waste. The widow's in-your-face annoyance of the judge finally wins the day. He's beaten up by her powerlessness in persistence. The judge's eyes, they're not open to justice. He doesn't have a change of heart. This isn't a Hallmark special where everybody lives happily ever after. He's still just an unjust judge. His heart wasn't warmed by compassion. His spirit wasn't compelled by righteousness. What made the difference? She just wore him out. That's what won her day. And her persistence paid off. In fact, it's often the most persistent types of folks who make it into history books. I reviewed the list of A&E's top 10 of the last 1,000 years that came out about 10 years ago or so, 13 years ago. Here's the top 10. Think about them. Galileo, Copernicus, Albert Einstein, Karl Marx, Christopher Columbus, William Shakespeare, Charles Darwin, Martin Luther, Isaac Newton, and Johann Gutenberg. Without exception, these exceptional people had a common trait. They had to be persistent in the face of presenting a new vision that was over and over rejected, and in some cases led to the threatening of their very lives. Each one of them in their own way. They had a widow-like persistence, and that's what's landed them in the top 10. Unwilling to yield to insurmountable opposition. We live by their vision of the future and not by the mass vision of the future. But this parable isn't just about persistence in general, is it? I mean, that would be a nice message in general, but that's not just what she's looking for. Her persistence is for justice. That's what makes some of the commentary around the parable interesting, because he starts by saying that it's a parable about persistence in prayer, and that you don't lose heart. But then he tells a parable about a woman who's persistent in justice. Biblically speaking, it meets the theme very well. God cannot tolerate injustice. That is the one overriding message of all of the prophets and in most of the Bible itself. God cannot tolerate injustice, either against his people or even the injustice of his own people against others. So what we need to know a little bit in this parable is that God cannot tolerate injustice. We're told in the early part of last century, the 1900s, that it was kind of a harsh time for labor practices, both in the United States and in Canada. Employees worked for more than 70 hours each week for low wages. There was no guarantee of a pension or even vacation time. The inequities of the labor market would lead to riots in the streets. And a pastor and newspaper editor named J.S. Woodsworth wrote an article calling for fair treatment and fair wages for laborers in Canada. And upon the article's publication, J.S. Woodsworth was arrested and thrown in jail for the article. The next day, Woodsworth paper issued another article on the labor situation in Canada. It was entitled this, "Editor Arrested for Quoting the Prophet Isaiah." And in that article, it talked about how the first article was simply putting together the ideas of Isaiah and applying them to today. Basically, he was saying, those were not my words. Those were Isaiah's words. Perhaps you should put Isaiah in prison. God cares about justice. God cares about fair play. God cares about how people treat one another, and he lifts up for his people the value of being just and seeking it. By the way, J.S. Woodsworth's life and beliefs could be summed up by the words on his tombstone. This is just an aside. There is still time to build a better world. I think I'll put that on my tombstone. You guys have to remember it, though. We need to understand that God hates injustice. That is a true biblical theme throughout the Old Testament. It's the whole in our gospel. God calls his people to work against injustice as well, to partner with him. The parable of Jesus isn't just about persistence, it's about persisting for just living with one another. We see this problem throughout our world. We don't have to scratch very deep into our own history, maybe even our own present. We can see it in our own land about racial tensions. We get confused about that as the majority white population, but over hundreds of years of oppression of African slaves brought to the United States, it's probably going to take us a few hundred years to kind of work out the damage of institutional forms of injustice that were wrought on a whole community of people. And yet it leaves us wondering why. Why? We look at the problems in the Middle East, and we can see how over the years, Western exploitation of Middle Eastern resources has created resentment. And do you know that it's actually the Western nations who remapped the Middle East? And so when we wonder about border skirmishes, we need to understand that we were part of putting together what we believed was justice, but not everyone shares that same belief. We put in power puppet leaders. Mubarak, Saddam Hussein. That was our own nation doing some of these things. And so when we look at an issue like justice, we have to also look at ourselves and question whether or not we aren't just getting justice, whether or not we're enacting justice for all as well. God takes seriously justice, and he asks us not only to fight for the justice of others, but to look deeply into our hearts and to examine the role of justice and how we are giving or not giving that kind of justice. Because there's always a price to pay for injustice. Whether we think about it, think it all the way through or not, there's often a price that's paid for injustice for someone's persistence who just stays with it. So listen to me, if you're being bullied at school, God cares about that. God cares about that injustice. If you're being harassed at the workplace, God cares about that harassment as well. If you're being taken advantage of, God is concerned about that injustice. And if you are doing any of those things, God is equally concerned about those things as well. There'll be a day of reckoning, the Bible promises. And if there's anyone anywhere praying for God to intervene, it ought to be us as God's people. So this parable is not just about persistence in general, but also persistence for justice, but also persistence in prayer. And prayer is that thing that opens an aperture between us and God. I know that oftentimes we think about prayer as sort of the bell on the desk, and we ring it for the cosmic bellhop to take our bags to the room. Give us a sunny day. Work it out for me. Give the Dodgers a home run. Let them win the pennant. All off, hope is lost. Sorry, look at Karen back there. There we go. Often we treat God as if it's our opportunity to change God, but the fact is it's the other way around. It's for praying people. When we open that aperture to God, it's God's opportunity to get to us. It's actually us acknowledging, okay, welcome in. And what happens more often for praying people is that our character and nature is shaped and changed by the presence of God in our life. And that's the true value of prayer. Not to make the cosmic bellhop jump, but to allow the God of the universe to shape and form us. So this prayer, this parable is more than just about persistence, more than just about persistence in justice. It's also allowing God to speak to us and shape us through prayer. A young black South African asked his minister when he was a young man suffering in poverty and hardship and oppression, why doesn't God do something? He has, said the wise older pastor. He created you. That young man was Desmond Tutu, who asked the question, now Archbishop of South Africa, and he became an answer to his own question, an answer to his own prayer. I think that's a good lesson for you and I, folks. While we're waiting for God to bring a perfect and just society, you and I are to answer the injustices of the world. That's what it means to take up the cross and follow Jesus into the world. It's not a comfortable position, it's not a popular position, but it is Christ's way in the world. But it's not the easy way. Fred Craddock, who teaches preaching, he's a homiletics professor, talked about a young pastor who delivered a spiritual talk in the Bible verse, knock and it shall be open to you. And in the audience of preachers, there was an elderly African-American gentleman who stood up and said, until you have stood for 70 years outside a locked door and you have bloody knuckles, you don't know the kind of prayer Jesus is talking about. This parable that Jesus gives isn't just about persistence in general. It's about persistence for justice. And it's persistence in prayer, the kind of prayer that leaves us changed. Prayer is so misunderstood, I think particularly among believers. Sometimes we treat it as, well, the last thing of the day, which I'm glad the girls pray, and I'm glad it's a bedtime prayer, but sometimes we treat it as the last resort, don't we? I remember a story about a shipwreck, and finally they were starting to take passengers off the boat, and the captain decided to the ship's chaplain to say a prayer over the loudspeaker, and it induced panic. Oh my God, is it that bad that we have to inflict prayer as a desperate Hail Mary attempt? Prayer isn't an attempt to get God to do what we want God to do. Prayer is an opportunity in which God comes to meet with the prayerful person, and it's the prayerful person who becomes changed by that encounter. Prayer ought to not be our last resort then. It should be our first, to shape the direction before we begin to take a step. So we're not really talking about a broad and easy way in this parable, are we? We're talking about a narrow way. We're talking about the way of the cross. We are the answer to the injustice in our world. Anywhere where people are being mistreated, anywhere people have needs that aren't being met, we are God's hands reaching out to them, because we are the ones reaching out to God. Social activist Jim Wallace tells about a group of folks who are doing just that thing. It's a Saturday morning. The food line has formed early outside. You're in trouble. My watch has stopped. Oh, wow. Okay. Sorry, that was too distracting. My ADD got the better of me. Where was I? Oh, social activist Jim Wallace. Good thing I have notes. Social activist Jim Wallace talks about a group of folks who are doing just that, reaching out in love's name to right wrongs and to create justice. It's a Saturday morning. The food line is formed outside the Sojourners Neighborhood Center, just 1.5 miles from the White House. 300 families stand in line for a bag of groceries that's critical of bridging them from one week to the next. And just before the doors are opened and all the people come in, all those who help prepare the food get together, and they join their hands together and they pray. And the prayer is often offered up by a woman named Mary Glover. Wallace says that she's the best prayer that they have. She's a 60-year-old black woman who knows what it means to be poor, and she knows how to pray. She prays like someone who knows to whom she's talking. She's been carrying on a conversation with her Lord for many, many years. And so she begins that day, says, first by thanking God for yet another day to serve you, Lord, she says. And on that day, Wallace says that he'll never forget the words that she prayed next. And she said, Lord, we know that you'll be coming through this line today. So, Lord, help us to treat you well. That's how we are to look at life. You are not supposed to be like other people. In the old era, in the church era, the era in which I was ordained, my big concern was that God would make me weird. And I've already admitted that to you still back in the church era. But as that era falls apart, we need to be weird. And we need to be different. If we're looking like the TV, we've got a problem, church. We do need to be God's unique people in the world. Light and salt and yeast and leaven to make change happen and to show that there's an alternative. It's not going to be easy to do. It's not going to be the broad way. Nobody's going to set out Sunday mornings so that we don't have soccer or baseball or other activities in the community, but we're still going to be that weird community that gathers together. And we're called to live a different life, one marked by persistence for God's vision of justice for all people, of God's vision of a people who pray and who are accompanied by a power and a peace that is beyond their circumstances and more often than not, beyond their understanding. And that's what we need to see in this parable. Wherever we see injustice of any kind, we're to understand that it's Jesus himself who's being victimized by it. When did we see you hungry? Jesus tells in one of his last parables in the book of Matthew. Or naked? When did we see you, Lord, in prison? And he answers, when you did it unto the least of these, you did it to me. He wants us to see the linkage between the suffering in the world and the suffering of God. And the suffering of God's people, a people accompanied by a power greater than that which is in this world. And that's what the story of the persistent widow is all about. It's about God's people, persistent in justice, persistent in prayer. The widow is a model of persistent prayer. She's also persistent in seeking justice. Prayer and justice are two of the things that God wants for all people, everywhere. In prayer, a strong and vital connection is made with God. With justice, a strong and vital connection is made in right relationship with one another. As Wordsworth said, Wordsworth said, there may still be time to build a better world. And indeed, folks, those of us caught up by God's vision of things have an awful lot to do. But we have a great God who is always with us. So let us be persistent, bold. Let us be those crazy, strange nuts that are difficult for the world to crack in order that we might build a better world.